The file on humanity was thin. Vreth Kal had read thinner ones. The Marathi came to mind, a species that had managed to invent fire twice before getting it right. But humanity's file was, by any professional standard, small. He held it on his reading glass, standing at the tall window of his office on the 42nd floor of the Assembly Research Tower, and he read it the way a doctor reads a chart from a patient with a very ordinary cold. Briskly, with mild interest, already thinking about lunch. Age of continuous civilization, 6,000 years. Recorded history, 4,000 of those. Space travel, 212 years. First contact with another species, 11 years ago. With the Kethma, Ashi, who had mistaken the human probe for a piece of fast-moving rock and nearly shot it out of the sky before someone thought to listen to the radio signals coming out of it. Vreth Kal set the reading glass down on his desk. Outside the window, the capital of Velhari Prime stretched in every direction. Towers made of pale stone that had been standing for longer than humanity had known what a tower was. Roads laid by engineers whose great-great-great-grandchildren were now assembly chancellors. Parks where trees older than human civilization grew in quiet and unbothered rows. He had worked in xenoarchaeology for 340 years. He had documented 31 young species as they stumbled into the wider galaxy. Nervous and loud and full of a specific kind of confidence that only came from not yet knowing how much they didn't know. He had written papers about them, given lectures, won an award once for his work on the Sorvian emergence period. He knew what a young species looked like. Humanity was going to be fine. Simple work. Maybe a year, maybe two, and then he could get back to his real research. He picked up the file again and flipped to the attached photograph. The formal delegation portrait, taken at the border station when the human ship crossed into Velhari space for the first time. 4 humans standing in a line, wearing dark clothes that fit them with the kind of precise severity that suggested someone had thought hard about what to wear. Yet he looked at the one in the middle, the delegation leader, Ambassador Yael Duran, the file said, age 53, former military, career diplomat for the last 20 years. She was looking at the camera the way someone looks at a door they have already decided they will open. He set the photograph down, made a small note on his datapad. Delegation leader. Composed. Then he went to lunch. The observer ceremony was held on the main floor of the assembly hall, which was the largest enclosed space on Velhari Prime, and possibly in the known galaxy, though there was an ongoing academic argument about that distinction that Vreth Kal had no interest in settling. The floor was made of dark stone that had been polished for so long it reflected light like still water. The ceiling was too high to see properly. And the gallery around the edges was filled with every species currently holding assembly membership. The Velhari in their tall chairs, the Kethma coiled in their environmental units, the Sorvian collective vibrating faintly at a frequency that translated, in the hall's atmosphere, as a kind of constant low hum. 61 species. The gathered weight of 800,000 years of recorded galactic civilization. The humans walked in from the east entrance. There were 4 of them. Doran at the front, the 3 others behind her in a neat line. The hall was very large. Their footsteps were very small. The sound they made crossing that dark stone floor was the sound of 4 people being very deliberately unimpressed by a room that had made larger delegations stop walking and simply look up for several minutes before remembering where they were going. Vreth Kal watched from his observer's bench near the front. He had a clear view of Doran's face as she crossed the floor. She was looking straight ahead, not at the ceiling, not at the gallery, not at the 61 species arrayed in a horseshoe of membership around the room's center. Straight ahead, the way someone looks when they already know where the chair is. Chancellor Sorveth stood at the podium. He was 1,200 years old, which made him the oldest living being in the assembly, and he had the kind of presence that 1,200 years of unbroken authority creates. Deep, unself-conscious, like the presence of a mountain that has simply been standing in the same place for a very long time. He smiled at the approaching humans with the specific warmth of a teacher receiving a promising but very small student. "We welcome," he said, and his voice moved through the hall the way sound moves through deep water. "The delegation of humanity to the Galactic Assembly. In recognition of their emerging civilization and their demonstrated readiness for wider contact, we are pleased to extend observer status, the first step on the long and rewarding path toward full membership. There was a sound from the gallery. Not laughter exactly. Nothing so undiplomatic as that. The Velhari equivalent, a soft exhalation, a slight brightening of the secondary eye, a micro shift in posture that meant, in their body language, something between how sweet and how small. It moved through the gallery in a slow wave. 61 species, all registering the same small amusement at the same small moment. Doran stood at the podium and received it. She did not smile tightly. She did not straighten up in the particular way that beings straighten up when they are trying to look taller than they are. Her face did not do anything at all, in the way that a stone does not do anything when water moves over it. She accepted the observer medallion, said the 7 formal words of the acceptance protocol, which every new observer species said, and which meant, essentially, "Thank you for having us." Then she stepped back from the podium and walked to the outer ring of the assembly floor, where a chair had been placed for the human delegation, smaller than the member chairs, a position behind the lowest tier with a slightly obstructed view of the main floor. She sat down in it, folded her hands, looked at nothing in particular. Vreth Cowell wrote in his notes, "Delegation leader, composed." Query: is this a cultural performance of stoicism or an individual trait? Then he wrote, "Low priority." His official assignment arrived the next morning. Cultural liaison and study coordinator for the human delegation. He was to be humanity's primary academic contact, responsible for their orientation to assembly procedure, for coordinating the study program, for producing the first comprehensive xenological report on their civilization within 2 standard years. He accepted with genuine pleasure. His colleague Thesivan, who worked in the next office and had an opinion about everything, Ash told him he was wasting his talents. 6,000 years, she said, leaning in his doorway, with the expression of someone watching a very good chef decide to make toast. "You'll be done in 6 months." "That's fine," and he said, "I could use something straightforward." She made a sound he chose to interpret as good-natured and went back to her own office, where she was doing something complicated with the pre-collapse Sorvian language trees that had kept her occupied for 40 years and showed no sign of being resolved soon. He made a folder, labeled it Humanity, Study Program, Year 1, opened a new template, the same template he had used for 31 species before this one, began filling in the standard protocol fields: geological survey, population genetics, mythological cataloging, social structure analysis, technological development timeline. He had done this so many times that his hands filled in the fields before he'd finished reading the labels. He scheduled his first formal meeting with Ambassador Doran for that afternoon in the small meeting room assigned to the human delegation, a room that was, by assembly standards, a modest space, and which he privately thought was probably very comfortable by the standards of a species that had been traveling in space for 212 years. She was already there when he arrived, sitting at the table, not looking at the view screen, not reviewing documents, not doing the various preparatory things that most species representatives did in the 10 minutes before a meeting. Just sitting, hands on the table, eyes on the middle distance. He sat down across from her, set out his datapad, smiled in the manner he had learned over 3 centuries was the most cross-culturally readable expression of professional warmth. Ambassador Doran, welcome formally to Velhari Prime. I'm Assessor Vreth Cowell. I'll be your primary liaison for the duration of the orientation program. I know who you are, she said. I read your file. He paused. My file? 340 years in xenoarchaeology, 31 emerging civilization studies. Award in, she appeared to access a memory. Sorvian emergence period research, roughly 80 years ago. You're very good at what you do. He felt something slightly odd, which he filed away without examining. Thank you. I've prepared a standard orientation package. He slid the data pad across the table. Assembly procedure, membership timeline, way the framework for the study program we'll be conducting over the next 2 years. It covers everything you'll need to. I'm sure it does, she said. She picked up the data pad without looking at it, set it beside her hand. Assessor, before you start on any of it, the geology, the cultural cataloging, all of it, I'd suggest you pull the scan of the Anatolian Shelf, the deep scan, the one that goes below the primary sediment layer. He stopped. I'm sorry? The Anatolian Shelf on Earth, the geological formation in the region historically referred to as Anatolia. She said this without any particular weight, as though she were telling him where to find the dining hall. There's a scan in your agency's existing survey data, standard planetary assessment, done when we applied for contact status. Pull it. Look at the deep strata. Below the top layer. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the expression of someone who has given directions and is now waiting for the other person to start walking. Why? He asked. Because it will help, she said. When you look at the cultural file. He waited for her to say more. She didn't. She picked up the orientation packet he'd brought and began, finally, to read it, with the efficient patience of someone processing a document they consider a formality. He wrote on his datapad, Recommendation R, Geological Survey, Anatolian Shelf, Deep Strata. Then below that, Reason Given, will help with cultural file. Then below that, after a pause, unclear what this means. He put a small star next to it, his standard notation for things he intended to return to. He had a list of about 40 such stars, I'd accumulated over years of fieldwork, and he got to them eventually, usually, when everything more pressing was resolved. He asked her 12 standard orientation questions. She answered them all without elaboration or complaint. At the end of the meeting, she shook his hand, a human greeting ritual he had read about, pressing palms together briefly, and said, "Thank you, Assessor. I expect we'll do good work." Then she left. He sat in the meeting room for a moment after she'd gone. Outside the window, the pale towers of Velhari Prime stood in the afternoon light. Below them, the old roads. Below them, the deep stone, 300 million year geology, bedrock older than life on most of the Assembly's worlds. He thought about her face during the observer ceremony, and the way she had walked across that floor, not performing composure, but simply having it, the way something very old and very fixed simply has the quality of being still. He thought about 31 emerging civilizations in the faces of 31 emerging species leaders as they received their observer medallions. He thought about what had been different. He could not name it precisely, not yet. He made a note, atypical affect profile, delegation leader, further observation warranted, and left it at that. Outside, the oldest trees in the Assembly Capitol moved in the wind with the slow certainty of things that have been moving in wind for longer than most things have existed. He walked back to his office, made himself tea, opened the orientation template, and kept filling in the fields. One, he did not pull the Anatolian Shelf scan that afternoon. He had 31 other things on his list with stars next to them. He would get to it. The first formal Assembly session that humanity attended as observers was a vote on a resource-sharing treaty between the Keth-Ma territories and the outer Velhari trade corridors. A medium-complexity matter, several decades in negotiation, and now at the final ratification stage. The gallery was relatively quiet. Most member species had sent junior delegates. It was administrative work, not history. Doran sat in the outer ring chair and watched the proceedings with the full attention of someone at a lecture they have paid good money to attend. She did not consult her datapad, did not whisper to her colleagues, did not do the various small things that representatives did when they thought nothing important was happening. She watched everything. Vreth Cowell, in his observer's bench, noticed that he had been watching her watch things for 40 minutes and had not taken a single note about the actual session. He wrote, Observation. Delegation leader pays complete attention to procedural minutia. Hypothesis. Overcorrecting for junior status, attempting to demonstrate engagement. Standard behavior in new observer species. He underlined standard. Then after a moment, crossed out the underline. When the session ended and the gallery began to empty, Sorveth stopped by the outer ring as he passed. A gracious gesture, a great man briefly acknowledging a small new entry. Ambassador Doran, he said, warm and unhurried. I hope you are finding your first session informative. Very much so, she said. Is there anything you find confusing? Anything I might help clarify? She looked at him. Her expression was perfectly courteous. "No, I think I understand the process very well." He smiled. "Of course, you'll find it becomes second nature in time. We were all new once." He moved on, continuing through the gallery, pausing to speak with other delegates, filling the vast old hall with the easy grace of someone entirely at home in it. Doran watched him go. Vreth Cal, from his bench, watched her watching him. There was something in her expression he couldn't read, not resentment, not awe. Something quieter and much harder to place. The expression of someone watching a performance of a thing they know very well, either from a seat they chose for reasons that have not yet been explained. He put a second star on his note about the Anatolian shelf. He would pull that scan tomorrow. Probably. The scan was in the survey archive, exactly where Doran had said it would be. Vreth Cowell pulled it up 3 weeks after his first meeting with her, on a quiet morning when his other work had temporarily settled into a lull. He had not forgotten the recommendation. He had simply, as he did with most things on the star list, waited until the pressure of other work lifted enough that the starred items could breathe. He opened the file. Standard Planetary Survey Scan, completed 4 years ago as part of humanity's contact status application. He navigated to the geological section, found the Anatolian shelf, and pulled the deep strata reading. He looked at it. The top layers were exactly what he expected. Standard sediment accumulation, the various compressed records of a young planet's recent history, flood deposits, ice retreat patterns, the fingerprints of weather and water doing what weather and water had always done, the kind of geology he could read in his sleep. He scrolled deeper. 74,000 years down in the timeline, a layer of ash, uniform, planetary in scope. He recognized it. Toba, a supervolcanic event that the human geological record had documented thoroughly. A near-extinction event that had reduced the human population to a few thousand individuals before they recovered. Dramatic but documented. He scrolled past it. Below that, another ash layer. He stopped scrolling. He zoomed in. The scan was high resolution, and the second layer was unmistakable. Wide, while uniform, composed of particulates that were distributed with a consistency that volcanic events didn't typically produce. Not concentrated at the source, the way supervolcanic ash dispersed, but even, as though it had come from everywhere at once and settled in a single moment. The dating software placed it at 190,000 years ago. He sat back. Ran the scan again to check for data corruption. The scan came back clean. He scrolled deeper. A third layer. 430,000 years ago. Same composition, same strange uniformity. He leaned forward. A fourth. 780,000 years ago. A fifth. 1.2 million. A sixth. He had to manually adjust the scan depth to reach it because the standard setting didn't go that far. It sat at the very edge of the instrument's range. Faint but unmistakable. The dating software gave him a range rather than a precise figure, the way it did at those depths. The range was 1.9 million to 2.4 million years before present. He sat at his desk for a long time without moving. 6 ash layers, each one with the same strange, too-even distribution. Each one sitting like a line drawn across the geological record. Sharp boundaries above and below. 6 clean breaks in the strata, spaced across 2 million years with an almost rhythmic regularity. Almost. The word was doing a great deal of work. He pulled the gap measurements. The time between the 6th layer and the 5th, approximately 450,000 years. Between the 5th and the 4th, roughly 370,000. Between the 4th and the 3rd, 290,000. And the gaps were getting shorter, each one smaller than the last, as though whatever produced these events was happening with increasing, he searched for the word, frequency. He sent a data query to the Earth survey team that had produced the original scan, requesting supplemental deep core drilling data from 3 additional sites. He marked it low priority so as not to flag it in the academic network and generate questions he wasn't ready to answer. Then he opened the population genetics file. He had assigned the genetics study to a graduate researcher named Paleth, who was thorough, methodical, and so meticulous with data verification that she had once spent 6 weeks confirming a single line of output before she would put her name on it. He trusted her work completely. She had sent the completed report 2 days ago. Well, he had skimmed it on receipt, noted the summary, filed the full report, moved on. He opened it now and read it properly. The summary had said, "Unusual founding bottleneck signature. Recommend review." The full report said something more. Human population genetics were in one specific and significant way completely unlike any other species in the assembly database. Every species that had been through major bottleneck events, massive population reductions, near extinction catastrophes, carried that history in their genes as a kind of noise. Diversity that narrowed, widened, narrowed again. The genetic record of a people moving through disaster was messy, variable, full of the biological echoes of desperate survival. Human genetics were not messy. They were almost uniform. Not in the way of a species that had never experienced variation, in the way of a species that had experienced enormous variation and then had it removed, repeatedly. 6 times, Paleth noted, with the careful precision of someone reporting a result they have checked many times because they don't fully believe it. The human population showed the signature of a near-complete reset. Reduction to a small group. Genetic reconstruction from a base so narrow it should have created severe inbreeding deficiencies. It hadn't. Each time, the population that emerged from the bottleneck was genetically healthy, functional, as though the reduction had not been a catastrophe but she had searched for a word he could tell and landed on. Selection. As though each time someone had chosen who stayed. He read that sentence 3 times. And then he opened a new document and wrote at the top, "Working hypothesis. 6 ASH events correspond to 6 genetic bottlenecks." He stared at this for a moment. Added, "Both appear deliberate in character." Then he looked at what he'd written, and the word deliberate sat there on the white of the screen with the weight of something that had not been invited. He deleted deliberate and wrote structured, which was more scientific and meant the same thing. He sent a follow-up request to Paleth. "Please cross-reference bottleneck dates against geological event timeline. Do not distribute findings until I respond." Then he opened the mythology catalog. It had been submitted by his other graduate researcher, a young Velhari named Korath, who had the specific energy of someone who had recently discovered what it meant to find a research problem genuinely interesting. He had attached a note. The note said, "Sir, I've checked the translation matrices 4 times and they appear to be functioning correctly. I'm reporting this as a methodology concern and would appreciate your guidance before I file the full report." Vreth Cowell read this and felt, for the first time in 340 years of fieldwork, a very small and specific sensation in his chest that he could only describe as something shifting. He opened the full report. Human mythological traditions had been studied in broad strokes during the contact status application process. Watson, the summary at that stage, had noted significant mythological diversity across isolated populations, standard for species of this development stage. Standard, diverse, move on. Korath had done the deeper work. He had taken the mythological records from 12 major isolated human cultural traditions, populations that, by geographic and historical evidence, had had no contact with each other for tens of thousands of years, and run a structural comparison. The comparison matrix was in the report. 12 traditions, dozens of structural narrative elements. Most of them varied wildly, the way you'd expect from 12 groups of people who had never spoken to each other, inventing their own stories in their own contexts over thousands of years. But there was one narrative structure that appeared in all 12. All of them, without exception, in groups separated by oceans, by mountain ranges, by tens of thousands of years of independent development. A civilization, a great one. So great that it had reached a dangerous place. A threshold. The myths described it differently in each tradition, but the structure was always the same, where continuing forward would cause a harm too large to accept. And so the civilization, not destroyed by an enemy, not killed by a disease, not ended by a catastrophe, chose to stop, set fire to what they had built, made themselves small again, went back to the beginning. The myths called it different things, an act of sacrifice, a gift to the future. the sleep before the true waking. But the structure was identical. The choice was always there. The destruction was always deliberate. The sleep was always temporary. And in 9 of the 12 traditions, there was a coda. They will wake when the time is right, or they will return when the world is ready. Or, in the oldest of the 12, in a language that predated recorded human history by a margin that Korath's translation software had found difficult to process. Not yet. Not yet. Frethkal put down the report. He sat in his chair in his office in the 42nd floor of the Assembly Research Tower and looked out the window at the pale towers and the old roads and the unbothered trees. His tea had gone cold. The light had shifted while he was reading, and the afternoon was deeper now, the shadows longer. He had 6 ash layers and 6 genetic bottlenecks, and 12 isolated mythological traditions telling the same story. He had a civilization that had been officially alive for 6,000 years. He had 6 events telling him it was much, much older than that. He opened a new query and sent it to the Geological Survey Office. Deep core data request. Multiple sites across the Earth's surface, all at maximum scan depth. He marked it urgent. For the first time in this project, he marked it urgent. He also moved Doran's recommendation note to the top of his working file and removed the star from beside it. A star meant, return to this when other things are done. He was done with other things. The reply from Paleth came the next morning. She had cross-referenced the dates. The 6 genetic bottlenecks corresponded to the 6 ash layers with a precision that made his data verification instinct say, run this again. He did. 3 times. The correlation held each time, tighter on each run, as the software refined its dating estimates. 6 events. Same date, within the margin of geological error, a planetary-scale ash event in a near-total genetic reset happening at the same time, 6 times across 2 million years. Paleth had added a note at the bottom of the rerun report. She had clearly spent some time deciding whether to include it, because it was written in the careful language of a scientist who wants to say something and also wants to protect themselves from being wrong. If I were to characterize the genetic signature without reference to the cause, I would say, the population was intentionally reduced to a chosen subset. The survivors show no random bottleneck distribution. Yes, they show selected trait preservation. The specific qualities that appear most clearly maintained across each reset are adaptive flexibility, cooperative behavior, and cognitive problem-solving capacity. Whatever reduced this population 6 times kept the same qualities each time. This is consistent with a managed program. I want to be clear that I am not asserting that. I am noting that the data is consistent with it. He read this 3 times. A managed program. He thought about who would manage such a program, and then the thought arrived that he did not want to arrive, the one that changed the shape of everything. What if the ones being managed and the ones doing the managing were the same people? He pushed back from his desk and stood up and walked to the window and stood there for several minutes, looking at the oldest trees without seeing them. He had just described in formal data language a species that had ended itself 6 times on purpose, and rebuilt, and ended itself again, and rebuilt, 6 times across 2 million years. Not because it was destroyed, because it chose to stop. He thought about Doran's face, the expression he hadn't been able to name, the complete absence of anything that looked like smallness, even in the smallest chair in the largest hall in the known galaxy. He thought about, not yet, not yet. He sent Doran a formal data query that afternoon, polite, precise, academic in every word. He attached the correlation chart, the 6 events, the 6 bottlenecks, the mythological overlap, and wrote, Ambassador Doran, I have encountered some anomalies in the preliminary data that I would appreciate your perspective on at your convenience. The attached figures suggest a timeline inconsistency that I am unable to resolve through standard methodology. The reply came within an hour. 4 words. No? They add up fine. He read this 4 times. Then he set his data pad down on his desk and looked at the wall of his office, where he had put up a printed version of the geological scan. The 6 ash layers rendered as horizontal lines across the depth chart, each one sitting in its place across 2 million years, like a series of deliberate marks on a page, like a count, like someone keeping track of something. He canceled his standing commitments for the following week, sent formal apologies to 3 conference panels he had agreed to sit on, or marked the human study file as active research, priority status in the agency database. Thesave knocked on his door at the end of the day and leaned in with her usual expression. "Still expecting 6 months?" He looked at her. "No," he said. She looked at the geological chart on his wall, at the 6 lines, at the way he was sitting, not relaxed, not distressed, but the particular posture of a person who has picked up a weight they did not expect. "What did you find?" "I don't know yet," he said. She waited to see if he would say more. He didn't. She left. He stayed at his desk until the building's lights shifted to evening mode, the scan chart on the wall throwing its 6 lines across the darkening room, and he thought about a civilization that had looked at everything it had built 6 times and chosen the fire. He thought about what kind of patience that required. He did not have the number yet, but he was starting to understand the shape of what it might be. Outside, the old trees moved in the dark, unhurried. They had been moving for a very long time. The permit for physical excavation on Earth was approved in 9 days. 9 days was fast. It was fast because nobody in the Assembly's Research Administration took the request particularly seriously. A xenoarchaeologist of Vrethkal's standing, requesting access to study a 6,000-year-old civilization? Of course, straightforward, academic, the kind of work the Assembly's research programs existed to support. The permit officer who processed the request made a small note in the file, "Distinguished scholar," or "Standard Young Civilization Study," and approved it before his tea finished brewing. Vrethkal read the approval and thought, "They have no idea what they just approved." He did not correct this impression. He arrived on Earth 6 weeks later with a team of 12, 4 xenoarchaeologists, 2 xenobiologists, a geological survey specialist, 2 data analysts, and 3 field technicians. He had told his team they were doing a standard deep culture excavation. He had not told them what he expected to find below the standard level. He wanted their reactions clean. The excavation site was in the Anatolian region, modern-day Turkey, on a high plateau that had been occupied by human civilization in one form or another for as far back as the surface record went. He had chosen the specific spot based on the deep scan anomalies, a place where all 6 ash layers were present and intact, stacked like the pages of a book that had been closed and reopened 6 times. The human government had assigned a liaison, as a courtesy, a young man named Erden, a geologist, who met them at the site with the particular expression of someone who is proud and nervous at the same time, and is not sure which one is showing on their face. He shook Vrethkal's hand and said it was a great honor, and that they were welcome to access anything they needed. Vrethkal thanked him and meant it. Then he looked at the plateau, dry grass, pale rock, a horizon of low mountains in every direction, and thought about what was underneath them. They began digging. The first layer was exactly what it was supposed to be. A human civilization, the familiar recorded kind, going back about 8,000 years at this particular site. The soil told the normal story: pottery, tools, the compressed residue of fires built, and buildings constructed and taken apart over millennia. His team moved through it efficiently, cataloging as they went, finding nothing that a dozen similar studies hadn't found before. They reached the first ash layer on the 4th day. His geological specialist, a careful Velhari woman named Shavara, crouched at the boundary and ran her instruments over it for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "This isn't volcanic ash." "I know," Vrethkal said. She looked at him. "What is it?" "I'm hoping you can tell me." She ran 3 more analysis sequences. In the ash was composed of materials that she could identify individually, none of them exotic, none of them unknown to science. But the combination and the way they had fused under enormous heat was unlike any natural event in the geological database. "This was very hot," she said finally. "Whatever made this, extraordinarily hot. And it happened everywhere at once, not from a central point outward, everywhere at the same time." She said this in the voice of a scientist describing an impossibility that the data has nevertheless confirmed. "Below it," Vrethkal said. She looked at him again. Then she looked at the cut face of the excavation. Below the ash layer, the soil color changed. subtly, but changed. They kept digging. What they found below the ash layer was architecture, not the architecture of a primitive people. When not caves shaped by hand, not rough-cut stone laid by trial and error. The shapes in the deep soil were unmistakably constructed. Corners that met at precise angles, surfaces that had been worked with instruments, the outlines of structures that had been designed by someone who understood the principles they were applying. The design philosophy was different from modern human construction, different from any human construction in the surface record, but Vreth Cowell had spent 3 centuries studying the shape of thought as expressed through what it built, and he recognized in these structures the same fundamental impulse, the same specific inclination towards certain proportions, certain spatial relationships, certain aesthetic choices that ran through the architecture above, the same handwriting after a very long illness. His team worked in silence for most of that day. There was something about the site that made unnecessary speech feel wrong, the way unnecessary speech feels wrong in very old libraries or at the sites of old battles. Not a superstitious feeling, a respectful one. On the second day below the first ash layer, they found the boundary of it, the edge of what had once been a significantly large settlement, extending in multiple directions, further than their current excavation allowed. Shavar dated the construction to approximately 120,000 years before present. 120,000. In the period, the surface records suggested humanity was still in its earliest stages of organized community living. Vreth did not say anything about this to his team. He wrote it in his personal notes and kept digging. They dug through 5 more ash layers. Each one was the same. That strange, uniform, too-even composition, that evidence of heat that came from everywhere at once. And below each one, architecture, culture, the signs of a people who had been building and thinking and organizing themselves for a very long time. The structures got simpler the deeper they went. Not cruder, not less intelligent, but simpler, more essential, stripped down to what mattered, as though each successive layer had been built by a people who had decided to take only the most important things with them. On the 9th day, they reached the 6th layer. Shavar's instruments had to be recalibrated twice to operate at that depth, and the material they were working through had been compressed by 2 million years of weight and time into something close to soft stone. The excavation required the careful work of people dismantling something irreplaceable, and his team moved accordingly, instinctively, without being told. The 6th ash layer was the deepest and the most complete. Whatever had produced it had burned hotter than the ones above. The boundary between it and what lay below was sharp as a cut. What lay below was different. Everything above the 6th layer, for all its age, had been made of materials that existed on Earth. Stone, clay, organic compounds, metals that could be found in the planet's crust. The structures below the 6th layer were made of something that Shavar's instruments identified, categorized, and then flagged as outside current material database. Not foreign to physics, not alien in composition, just outside the database, unknown. How is that possible? One of the younger team members asked. Vreth said, "Keep going." They found the chamber on the 12th day. It was not large. In the context of the structures around it, the remnants of what appeared to have been a significant settlement, complex and thoughtfully arranged, the chamber was a small thing. It sat at what Vreth Cowell's structural analysis tagged as a central position in the settlement's layout. Not the largest building, not the most prominent, but the most protected. Built inside 3 concentric shells of that unknown material, nested like the layers of a seed. The outer shells had survived 2 million years without significant degradation. The inner chamber was intact. They opened it carefully, not forced because it had a mechanism which his team spent half a day studying before they understood how it was meant to be operated. And the air that moved out of it when it opened was not stale in the way ancient sealed spaces were stale. It was simply still, very still. The stillness of something that has been waiting rather than decaying. Inside the chamber there was almost nothing. A floor, smooth, made of the same unknown material as the outer shells. A ceiling low, and on the far wall, a sequence, not a painting, not a carving. something that had been applied to the wall surface at a molecular level in a pattern that his imaging instruments took 3 hours to fully map. It was a biological sequence. His xenobiologist, Parith, had worked over it for an afternoon without speaking. Then she came to him at the end of the day, when the rest of the team was making camp, and she said in the careful voice that scientists use when they have checked a result too many times and it keeps coming back the same. It's DNA. Human DNA? A segment of it, a specific segment. She pulled up the comparison on her data screen. It's from the non-coding regions, the parts that don't make proteins, the parts that have been labeled for most of human genetic science's history as, she paused, junk DNA, sequences with no apparent function. This sequence has a function, Vrethkal said. Yes, she looked at her screen. It's a message. The structure is a message. And the match? She turned the screen toward him. A comparison analysis. The sequence from the chamber wall on one side, a human genetic sample on the other. It matches at 99.7% fidelity. This exact sequence, what's written on this wall, is present in the non-coding DNA of every living human being on Earth. The chamber was very quiet. They encoded it into themselves, Vrethkal said. Yes, 2 million years ago. Yes. He looked at the sequence on the wall, at the comparison on the screen. 2 million years of genetic inheritance, passing this message forward through every generation that had ever lived, through every disaster and rebuilding, through every ash layer and every new beginning, carrying it without knowing they carried it. Every human alive on the surface above them, right now, walking through their days, carrying these words in every cell of their bodies. When can you decode it? He asked. I've started, she said. It's not a simple cipher. It's structured, complex. It's going to take time. How much time? She looked at the screen. Weeks, maybe more. Do it, he said. Nothing else. Just this. She nodded and went back to work. He stood in the entrance of the chamber and looked at the sequence on the wall for a long time. In the lamplight, the molecular patterns had a faint luminescence. Not because they were designed to glow, he thought, but because the material responded to light in a way that 2 million years had not diminished. He thought about 12 isolated mythological traditions telling the same story, about 6 genetic bottlenecks, perfectly timed, about the same handwriting appearing in architecture separated by 1 million years. He thought about the phrase that appeared in the oldest of the mythological texts. Not yet. Not yet. He thought about what kind of people built a message into the structure of their own biology so that it could not be lost, so that even if everything else burned, even if the stones and the records and the language and the name of the civilization all turned to ash, the message would survive in the bodies of every person who came after, waiting to be read. The kind of people, he thought, who had already decided they were going to burn everything and needed to make sure they remembered why. 3 weeks later, Parith came to him at the dig site with the decoded message. It was not long. He had half expected something encyclopedic, a full record of a civilization, its history and knowledge, everything it was, and it preserved in genetic code. What she handed him was much shorter than that. He read it twice. Then he sat down on a piece of ancient stone that had been part of something enormous 2 million years ago and read it a third time. Not yet. The others are not ready. Not yet. When you are no longer alone, begin. That was it. The entirety of what they had carried. The sum of what a civilization had encoded into the biological inheritance of every descendant it would ever have, across 2 million years. Not a library, a note, a single instruction left by people who had decided to make themselves small and wait for whoever came after them, whenever they finally needed to know why. Not yet. The others are not ready. The others. He looked up from the message at the plateau around him, the dry grass, the pale rock, the low mountains on the horizon, a sky that was the same color as the sky had been 2 million years ago, unchanged, not caring about anything that happened under it. The others. They had reset 6 times, not because they failed, not because they were destroyed, because they had looked outward every time and found nothing. No other species, no other mind, nothing worth staying for, when staying meant reaching the dangerous place, whatever the dangerous place was, alone. So they went back. Smaller, safer, waited. 5 more times. And then 212 years ago, a probe drifted across a border and a Kethma scout ship almost shot it down before thinking to listen. And for the first time in 2 million years, humanity looked outward and found someone looking back. Vrethkal sat on his ancient stone and understood, for the first time, what Doran's face had looked like during the observer ceremony. The expression he hadn't been able to name. It was not patience. It was recognition. The wait was over. Back on Velhari Prime, in the assembly hall, Chancellor Sorveth was giving a speech about humanity in the plenary session. He knew because Korath had sent a transcript. Sorveth was calling humanity our most recent and most endearing addition. The hall, Korath's note said, had murmured warmly. Doran was in her small outer ring chair, hands folded, face still. Vreth Cowell put the decoded message in his personal safe, sent Parath a message telling her to do the same with all her working files, and sat on his ancient stone for a while longer, looking at the mountains, 2 million years old. And they had a chair in the outer ring with a slightly obstructed view. He started writing his report. He requested a minor academic panel. Because he had a completed study, and a completed study required a presentation. And a minor academic panel was the appropriate venue for presenting a completed study. He filled in the request form the way he had filled in 31 such forms before, with the specific efficient disinterest of someone doing a familiar administrative task, and sent it to the Assembly Research Coordination Office. He did not request a full chamber session. He did not flag the findings as significant in the submission form's priority field. He marked it Standard Study Conclusion. Young Civilization, First Contact Assessment, Standard, Young. The words sat in the form doing their quiet work. The panel was scheduled for a standard-sized conference hall, 40 seats, the kind of room where 300 years of carefully conducted academic work had been presented to attentive audiences of between 15 and 30 people, received with the warm, professional interest of peers who cared about such things. He arrived early to check the equipment. By the time the panel was scheduled to begin, there were 62 people in the room. The 40 seats were full, and the rest were standing along the walls. He had not told anyone what was in the report, but he had been in academic circles long enough to know that the specific way you said nothing could say something very loud. The way he had canceled 3 conference panels. The way his team had been given unusual data handling instructions. The way Parath had not published anything from the excavation, not even preliminary findings, in 5 months. Academic communities noticed absences. The absence of expected output from a well-resourced study after several months of work was itself a form of signal. Vrethkal looked at the 62 people in the room, xenoarchaeologists, xenobiologists, historians, 3 assembly members who were not listed on the panel registration and had arrived without explanation, and thought, this is still manageable. 62 people was still a contained audience, still a professional space. He put his data on the presentation screen and began. He was methodical. Sure, he had spent 3 centuries learning that the best way to deliver a difficult finding was to lead with the data and let the data do the work. Do not editorialize. Do not frame. Do not tell people how to feel about what they are being shown. Show them the numbers and let the numbers speak for themselves, and trust that scientists, given clean data, will reach correct conclusions. He put up the first chart, the geological scan, 6 ash layers rendered as horizontal lines across the depth profile. The first layer, labeled in standard notation, Toba event 74,000 BP. The second layer, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth. These are the major geological event markers recovered from deep core drilling at multiple sites across the study planet, he said. As each represents a widespread ash deposit with compositional characteristics inconsistent with any known natural geological event. He let that sit for a moment, just a moment. The deepest of these 6 layers is dated to approximately 2.3 million years before present. The room was quiet, the specific quality of quiet that a room of scientists produces when they are processing a number that doesn't fit their model. He put up the second chart. The genetics. Cross-referencing with the population genetics study, we observed 6 distinct genetic bottleneck events, each corresponding in timing to one of the ash layer events. He walked through the correlation data at a moderate pace. He noted Paleth's finding that each bottleneck showed characteristics consistent not with random catastrophic loss, but with selective reduction, that the same trait cluster, adaptive flexibility, cooperative behavior, high-range cognitive problem-solving, was preserved through each event. Someone in the third row raised a hand. He acknowledged them. When you say selective reduction, they said carefully, I mean, he said, that the data is consistent with a managed process, a deliberate reduction to a chosen population subset. The room found a new quality of quiet, a little deeper than before. He put up the third chart, the mythological comparison, the 12 isolated cultural traditions, the structural overlap matrix, the narrative that appeared in various forms in all 12, the great civilization, the dangerous threshold, the deliberate stop, the chosen burning, the sleep before the waking. He did not tell them what to notice. He let them look. He heard from somewhere in the standing section along the back wall a single sharp exhale, not a gasp. Something more controlled than a gasp. The sound of a person who is maintaining their professional composure and just barely managing it. He clicked to the next chart. The physical excavation recovered 6 distinct architectural layers below the surface record, he said, each separated from the next by one of the ash event boundaries. Each layer displays structural and aesthetic characteristics consistent with the same fundamental design intelligence as the layers above it, and with each other. He showed them the images. The ruins below the first ash layer, below the second, below the fifth, below the sixth. The deep ruins in their unknown material still intact after 2 million years. He showed them the comparison images, details of structural design from the deepest layer and from a modern human building, side by side. The engineering philosophy is consistent, he said. The materials and complexity differ enormously. The underlying approach does not. Nobody asked questions. They were all watching the screen. Finally, he said, and he put up the image of the chamber, the sequence on the wall, the comparison to the human genome, the decoding analysis. Within the oldest architectural layer, we recovered an encoded message. The encoding medium is a biological sequence matching, at 99.7% fidelity, a section of the non-coding genome present in every living member of the study species. He let them look at the comparison, at what 99.7% fidelity look like on a chart. This sequence has been present in the human genome since at least the time of the oldest layer, passed through every generation. It was decoded from the chamber wall inscription. The message is as follows. He read it aloud. Not yet. The others are not ready. Not yet. When you are no longer alone, begin. The room was very still. Vreth Kaul looked at his data screen. He had one more slide. He clicked to it. It was a single number. He had put it on a white background with nothing else. No labels. No supporting data. Just the number. 2,300,000 years. This, he said, is the minimum age of continuous intelligent activity on Earth, based on the physical evidence recovered. Continuous not in the political or institutional sense used by the Assembly's civilizational age metrics, but in the genetic and material sense. The same intelligence, the same species, operating, resetting, rebuilding, across 2.3 million years. He turned off the presentation. I'll take questions, he said. The first question was, are you certain of the dating? He said yes. The second question was, have you considered the possibility that the lower layers represent a predecessor species rather than the same species? He said he had. He referenced the genetic continuity data, the same lineage, unbroken, from the deepest layer to the present, and the architectural consistency and the fact that the encoded message was in the modern human genome. Not a predecessor species, the same species. The third question did not come from the panel. It came from one of the assembly members standing along the wall, an elderly Kethma historian named Soth Vel, who had been in the room for the entire presentation and had not moved. If their continuous record is 2.3 million years, she said, that is older than the oldest member civilization in the assembly by a factor of nearly 3, Vreth Cowell said. The room absorbed this. The oldest civilization in the Galactic Assembly had been building in an unbroken line for 800,000 years. They had seats on the inner ring. They had shaped assembly policy for 6 centuries. They were considered by common consensus the closest thing the galaxy had to institutional memory. Humanity was 2.5 times older, and had been sitting in the outer ring with a slightly obstructed view. Someone in the room laughed, not cruelly, not mockingly. The way a person laughs when the universe makes a joke at their expense that is so perfectly constructed that the only response is to appreciate the craftsmanship. It was a short sound, and several people joined it, and then it faded because the room understood that what they were dealing with was not, fundamentally, funny. Then someone else asked the question that everyone in the room had been moving toward, the one that had been building from the moment he read the message aloud, and that no one had asked yet because asking it meant confronting something very large. Why did they stop resetting? Vreth Cowell looked at the room. 62 people, all of them well-educated, all of them smart, all of them very aware that they were standing at the edge of something that was going to change how they understood everything. The message says, he said, that they would continue until they were no longer alone. Until the others, he chose not to say us, but everyone in the room heard it. We're ready. Ready for what? He picked up his data pad. He turned it off. He placed it in his bag. I don't know, he said. I've been thinking about that for 3 months. I haven't arrived at an answer I trust. He did not say, but I think it's the most important question anyone in this room has ever asked. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room was already thinking it. He also did not say, Doran is in the outer hall right now. He had not told the panel she was there. He had not invited her. He had not uninvited her. Hey, she was in the building. He had seen her in the corridor as he arrived, sitting on a bench outside the hall door, reading something on a small device, looking for all the world like a person simply waiting for a convenient moment to ask an administrative question. He looked at the door. It was closed. I think, said Sothvel from the back of the room, we need a full session. Yes, said Vreth Cowell. Tomorrow. Yes. She looked at the door too. Is she in the hall, he said. Does she know what you found? He thought about the reply he had received to his first data query. 4 words. No. They add up fine. Yes, he said. She's known the whole time. The room took this in. 62 academics and 3 assembly members standing in a conference hall that was too small for what it had just been asked to hold, while rearranging their understanding of a civilization they had, until 70 minutes ago, been classifying as young. Sothvel looked at the image still faintly visible on the darkened presentation screen, the chamber wall, the sequence, the decoded words. When you are no longer alone, begin. Begin what? She said. It was not really a question, not one anyone expected him to answer. It was the sound of a person standing at the edge of something very large and looking at how far down it went. Vreth Cowell had no answer. He had been asking himself the same question for 3 months, and the only response he'd arrived at was the feeling that he was not quite ready to know. He packed his bag. The room began to empty, people moving in the particular way they moved when they had too much to process. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the careful pacing of people who need to think. He walked to the door, opened it. Doran was in the hall on the bench, still reading. She looked up as he came out. Her face was the same as it always was. Full session tomorrow, he said. I heard, she said. Are you ready for that? She considered the question, not as though it was difficult, as though she was deciding how much of the answer to give. Yes, she said. We've been ready for a long time. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Behind him, the last of the 62 people were filing out, moving past him quietly, none of them looking at anything in particular, all of them very busy inside their own heads. The message, he said. Begin. What does it mean? What were you supposed to begin? She looked at him, not unkindly, not reluctantly. That, she said. Ash is a conversation for after the session. She went back to her reading. He stood in the doorway a moment longer, and then he walked down the corridor, and the building held its breath around him. And outside, the very old trees did what they always did, patient as anything, waiting for the weather to change. It was changing. It was already changing. The full session was scheduled for the next morning. By midnight, every seat in the main assembly hall was filled. There were no empty galleries. There were species representatives in chairs that had been brought in and placed in the aisles. There were 12 assembly members who had traveled through the night from off-world stations, arriving by fast transit at hours that made their aides look tired and bewildered. And there were researchers who had no official reason to be present and were present anyway, sitting quietly in the back with the careful look of people who understood they were about to witness something they would spend the rest of their lives trying to correctly describe. Vrethkal arrived early and sat in the presenter's position on the main floor. He had not slept. Not because he was anxious exactly, but because his mind had spent the hours between midnight and dawn doing what it had been doing for 3 months. Turning the problem over, looking at the same data from every angle he could find, trying to reach the bottom of it and finding that there was no bottom. He had brought no new materials. Everything he needed was in what he had already shown the panel. He was not here to present new data, for he was here to let the room understand what the existing data meant. Doran was in her outer ring chair. She had arrived before him. She was the first person in the hall, apparently, because the security staff noted her arrival time as 40 minutes before any other delegate. She had sat down, folded her hands, and waited. The hall filled around her. At no point did she look around at the filling gallery, or consult her data device, or speak to anyone. She sat with the same expression she always wore, the one Vrethkal had spent months trying to correctly name. And she waited for the session to begin. He did not repeat the full presentation. He summarized it in 12 minutes. The 6 layers, the genetic correlation, the message, the timeline. He laid it out in clean, plain language and then stopped. And because the room had already read the circulated preliminary summary, and most of what he was saying was confirmation rather than revelation. The revelation had happened the night before. This morning was about what came after. When he finished the summary, Chancellor Sorveth, who was present in his full formal position, something that happened only for the most consequential sessions, said, "Assessor Vrethkal, let me be certain I understand the conclusion correctly. You are saying that the species we admitted to observer status 11 days ago has been intellectually and biologically continuous for 2 million years. 2.3 million, Vrethkal said, as a minimum estimate." Sorveth was quiet for a moment. "And in that time, where they chose to destroy their own civilization 6 times. The evidence is consistent with deliberate resets, yes, because they were waiting. That is what the message suggests." Sorveth looked at the outer ring, at Doran's chair, and at Doran sitting in it. "Because," he said slowly, "the galaxy was not yet," he found the word from the message, "ready." The hall was very quiet, not the comfortable institutional quiet of a room at rest, the held breath quiet of a room that is doing very fast and uncomfortable mathematics. The mathematics went like this. If humanity had been cycling through civilizational resets for 2 million years, patiently waiting for other intelligent life to develop, patiently making themselves smaller and safer each time, resetting their own clock. What did that mean? What did it mean that they had watched from a distance as 61 other species found their footing? What did it mean that they had been alive in some form longer than any civilization in this room had existed? What did it mean that the assembly had given them a small chair in the outer ring? An assembly member from the Sorvian collective, a being who communicated through a translation matrix in low harmonics, asked, "What is their actual civilizational age, by any reasonable metric, compared to our oldest member?" Vrethkal pulled up the single number he had shown the panel the night before. 2,300,000. The assembly's oldest member civilization, 800,000 years. The harmonic that the Sorvian collective member produced was not part of any standard emotional register in their translation matrix. Well, the translation software rendered it as query no matching output, approximate Profound recalibration. Sothvel, the Kethma historian, spoke from her seat in the membership gallery. There is something I think the Assembly needs to state plainly before we continue. The question being implied but not asked is this: have we been misunderstanding the situation? Nobody answered immediately. The question was too accurate to answer quickly. Yes, said Vrethkal. The word landed in the hall with a simplicity that made it somehow larger than a complicated sentence would have been. Just that one word, sitting in the enormous old room like a small, very heavy stone. Yes, he said again. By the metrics we use, humanity is 6,000 years old. By any other metric, by material continuity, by biological continuity, how by the evidence of an unbroken intelligence operating on their world for 2 million years. They are the oldest civilization we have ever encountered. He paused. We gave them a small chair in the outer ring. From somewhere in the gallery, he never identified who, a sound rose. Not the soft, warm exhalation of the observer ceremony. Not the gentle amusement of a senior civilization indulging a younger one. Something different. The sound of 61 species simultaneously arriving at the same deeply uncomfortable realization. It was Sorveth himself who moved, 1,200 years old, the longest-serving chancellor in Assembly history, a being who had been present at the admission of 19 new species, who had guided the Assembly through 6 major geopolitical crises, who was, by any reasonable standard, the most experienced person in the room. He stood. He walked from his position at the head of the chamber floor across the dark polished stone. The same walk that Doran's delegation had made 11 days ago. The walk across the open space where 61 species observed from the gallery above. He walked to the outer ring. He stopped in front of Doran's chair. She looked up at him. Her face was the same as it always was. Composed. Not cold, composed. The difference mattered. Ambassador Doran, he said, and the hall's acoustics carried his voice to every corner, with the completeness they had been designed to carry sound. On behalf of the Galactic Assembly, I would like to invite the delegation of humanity to full membership. Inner ring, voting status. With all rights, responsibilities, and he paused. And when he continued, his voice had something in it that had not been there at the observer ceremony. Something that was not quite performance. With our apologies for the delay. The hall was very still. Doran looked at him for a moment, not triumphantly, not with the satisfaction of a point proven, with the same expression she had worn during the observer ceremony, the same one she had worn every time Vrethkal had watched her sit in that small outer ring chair and observe a galaxy that had been talking about her species as though it were a promising student rather than the oldest teacher in the room. She stood up. "Thank you, Chancellor," she said. They brought a new chair. It took a while because the Assembly's protocol office had to locate the largest and most central position on the inner ring floor, and then someone had to confirm that there was, in fact, a chair large enough to be appropriate for the occasion, and then someone else had to confirm that the space on the inner ring was actually open and not claimed by another delegation's secondary seating. While this was happening, Sorveth stood with Doran in the center of the floor, and the gallery watched, and the hall made no sound. Sorveth asked her, and his voice was quiet this time, not carrying to the full hall, but contained between the two of them, though Vrethkal was close enough to hear. "Why did you stop? The resets. Why not a 7th? She looked at him. The question was the same one Vrethkal had been circling for months, the same one the panel had produced and left unanswered. The most important question in the room. She spoke quietly between two people standing on dark polished stone. Doran turned slightly and looked at the gallery, at the 61 species arrayed around the hall, the Velhari in their tall chairs, the Kethma in their environmental units, the Sorvian collective, the 31 young civilizations who had been found and welcomed and given seats in the time since humanity's last reset. The whole breadth of what the galaxy had become in 200,000 years of comparative quiet. She turned back to Sorveth. "Because this time," she said, "we're not alone." The hall held this, the enormous old hall with its ceiling too high to see and its stone floor polished by 8 centuries of footsteps and its gallery filled with the full range of minds that the galaxy had managed to produce. Not alone. That was the answer to 6 resets. That was the answer to 2 million years of patience. Not ambition, not conquest, not the arrival of a power that had been waiting to declare itself. Just that, the simple fact of other people. The galaxy finally populated enough to be worth staying in. 6 times they had looked outward and found nothing worth burning their ceiling for. 6 times they had chosen to be small rather than be alone in their largeness. And then, 212 years ago, a probe drifted across a border, and a scout ship almost shot it down, and everything changed. The chair arrived. A proper chair, center of the inner ring, with a direct and unobstructed view of the main floor. Doran sat in it, folded her hands. The gallery above stirred with the particular energy of a room that is going to be talking about this moment for a very long time. Vreth Cal watched from his presenter's position. He had been thinking all morning about the part of the message that no one had addressed. The part that sat at the end of the decoded sequence, after the instruction to wait, after the condition that defined the waiting. When you are no longer alone, begin. He had spent 3 months unable to answer what that meant. He had asked Doran in the corridor the night before, and she had said, "That is a conversation for after the session." The session was over. He waited until the formal proceedings had moved into recess, the procedural upheaval of a historical revision being processed, the administrative machinery of the assembly beginning to recalibrate itself around a new reality. And then he walked across the floor to where Doran was sitting in her new chair. She saw him coming. He sat down in a chair nearby, looked at her. "After the session," he said. "Yes," she said. "Begin what?" She was quiet for a moment, not evasive, considering. The way she considered everything, with the patience of something that knows it has time. "You understand what the resets were," she said. "Each time we reach the dangerous place." "What is the dangerous place?" "The point," she said, "where a single species, operating alone, with everything it knows and everything it's built, becomes large enough to cause irreversible harm." She said this plainly. "We kept reaching it alone, and alone we didn't trust ourselves. 6 times we decided, not yet, not ready." He thought about this. "And now?" "Now," she said, "we are not alone. The galaxy is full of you, of minds that are not ours, of perspectives we don't have, values that check ours, species that would push back." She looked at the gallery, the 61 species still in their seats, the hall full of the gathered weight of minds that were not human. That is the answer to the dangerous place, not going back to zero, not making ourselves small forever. She paused. The answer was always to wait until the universe had enough other people in it that no one species, not us, not anyone, could go too far without being stopped. Vreth Cal sat with this. "That's what begin means," he said. Not a question. That's what begin means. He thought about a civilization that had looked at its own potential for harm and chosen 6 times to go back to the beginning rather than risk the damage of going forward alone. Heck, he thought about the message encoded in every cell of every human body. Not a declaration of power, not a promise of conquest, but an instruction in restraint. Not yet. The others are not ready. He thought about what it said about a species that its greatest monument, the thing it had worked hardest to preserve across 2 million years of burning and rebuilding, was a reminder to be careful. "You were afraid of yourselves," he said. "We were realistic about ourselves," she said. The difference in her voice was clear. Not shame, not humility as performance. The flat and honest accounting of a people who had looked at what they were capable of and made a decision about it. In the gallery above, the assembly was in the early stages of 100 different conversations that were going to last a very long time. And the oldest member civilizations talking to each other with the specific expressions of beings reconsidering things they thought were settled. The younger species, the ones like the Marathi who had needed 2 tries at fire, looking at each other with varying degrees of the same expression that Vreth Cal had felt when he first read the decoded message. Not quite fear, not quite awe. The sensation of a floor proving to be deeper than you had assumed. The vertigo of scale. He looked at Doran. She was watching the gallery with the expression he had spent the better part of a year trying to name. He could name it now. It was the expression of someone watching children she has been keeping an eye on for a very long time, finally doing something that lets her know they are going to be all right. Not condescension. Way under the opposite of condescension. Care. The kind of care that waits. That makes itself small, so the thing it cares about has room to grow. That resets 6 times rather than risk crowding something young. 2 million years of it. He sat in his chair on the inner ring floor of the oldest and most powerful governing body in the known galaxy, and he thought about an old tree that had been making itself small for so long that everyone who walked past it had mistaken it for a sapling. The tree had always known what it was. It had been waiting for the right season to grow. Outside, the day was doing what days did. The light moved. The old city went about its business. What the trees that had been standing for longer than most things had existed moved in the wind with the unhurried ease of things that understand time in a way that most things don't. And in the inner ring of the Galactic Assembly, in the best chair on the floor, Yael Dorn of Earth folded her hands and looked at the gathered weight of everything the universe had managed to build since the last time her people went to sleep. She was not impressed. She was, after 2 million years, finally home.